Today we're going to be discussing the British Empire, and in fact, indeed, the thing that I think most of us obviously know about in some way or another, and the impact that it has um, sort of across time and space. So, a couple of things that our reading pointed out this week is that the British Empire is not just a one size fits all thing, right? The British Empire is something that is gained over the course of many decades and many centuries indeed, particularly when you look at places like Ireland in the 1500s, certainly places like Scotland, even though it's probably not a great example for empire, because it's part of the United Kingdom itself. Or when we start looking at places like India in the 19th century, or South Africa in the 19th century, or Canada in the 17th century, or Australia in the late um, Australia in the late 18th century. So you can see that there are these different piecemeal gainings of the colonies, and more importantly, when we try and sort of make a blanket statement about this is what the empire was, it doesn't necessarily work. However, it is also important to understand that the empire did provide certain benefits, obviously, to the British people themselves, who were back in London or back in England, Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. But it also, in some ways, brought benefits to the people of different colonies. But it also increased huge amounts of subjugation and poor treatment um, among people. One of the really interesting quotes that I thought came from the articles today was a quote that said something to the effect of um, the British Empire, the sun did not always shine on the British Empire, but it never set. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it, right? If we think about the sun sort of metaphorically, the sun is not always shining on the British Empire, right? It's not all great. But the British Empire was so large that um, the sun never set on it. And that's an interesting way to think about the British Empire, obviously. So when we look at the British Empire, and this is a map that I'm going to keep coming back to, the British Empire by the 1900 was tremendous, right? If we look at it here, right, it goes from, I don't know why Alaska is colored in, but it goes from Canada into the Caribbean, into parts of Central America, Guyana. It goes across the Atlantic to obviously Britain itself, Ireland. Then it goes into Africa. In Africa itself, Britain controlled a territory that was larger, or at least as large as Europe itself, across the Middle East, into India, into Indonesia, to South China, and then Australia and New Zealand. You're talking about just a tremendous empire. And the people within the empire will be hugely important to Britain's success, whether that's in World War One, where you have British troops fighting alongside Indian troops, or New Zealand troops, or Australian troops, or African troops, or Canadian troops. You have British involvement and British imperial involvement throughout all of this. The British Empire is also plagued by competition and war. One engagement that was not discussed in the reading for today, but I do want to make sure I discuss, is the Crimean War. So the Crimean War is a war that happens between Britain, France. So it's a coalition between of the British, the French, the Ottomans, and Sardinia, which is which is an island off the coast of India, and they wind up defeating a Russian army, right? So the Russians are moving into a territory called Crimea, which is this territory here, and starting to move in on Ottoman territory, right? So the Ottoman Empire, founded in the 1400s, is losing gusto by the 1800s, and the Russians are trying to move in. Now that alarms the British, French, Ottomans, and Sardinians, because it's giving more and more authority, more and more power to the Ottoman Empire. To the Russian Empire, and that's making people nervous. But what's important here is to notice that this fight winds up sort of pushing Russia back. It certainly creates tension within Russia because now Russia has lost some of its supremacy. But the other piece to this is it sort of shows us the competition, right? We are nervous about territory. We are nervous about who's going to get that land mass. And although this is very far from France, very far from Britain, it shows that the British and the French, the Ottomans, the Sardinians are concerned about who is going to get the ability to take more land. So this creates more problems for the British, right? The other big engagement that happens at this time is something called the Sepoy Mutiny. So sometimes we call this the Sepoy Mutiny. Other times we call it the Indian Rebellion. It really just depends on your perspective. In another case, some people call it the First Indian War for Independence. Again, the name here, whatever you call it, is sort of your own preference. Why does it start? The British East India Company is a company that has major trading depots in India, or sort of all of South Asia, stretching back to the 1600s. Now, the British East India Company is selling teas, spices, cottons, other products that are really important to British culture, but also British industrialization. And the British because India is so far away from Britain, the British are not really sending over a ton of troops that you have to then pay British wages to. So instead what they do, the British, is they fund a group of Indian-born British trained soldiers called sepoys. Now, where this is happening, right? So where is this? This is in the Bengal region of India, which is where the cursor currently is. And they're training these men to be soldiers. Now, there's a couple pieces to this, right? The Bengal region is a very interesting region because it's not, India has many different cultures and many different groups, right? But one major group is Indian Hindus. The other group is Indian Muslims. So you have two religions, Hindu, Muslim, and the British are pretty awful to both of them, sort of in what you might think of as a stereotypical British fashion. There is poor treatment of these people, cultural appropriations, cultural misunderstandings, cultural beliefs of cultural supremacy on the part of the British. Just awful things that the British are antagonizing these warriors that they're paying. The fight ultimately breaks out. There had been ideas of trying to get rid of the British for a while, and then the British government sent in a new rifle called the Enfield rifle. And the Enfield rifle comes with little cartridges that look to be greased with a product, right? And they are saying it's petroleum. But there's a rumor that has started, and this is not true, but there's a rumor that started that says it's a mixture of pig and beef fat. And if Hindus cannot touch beef products, Muslims cannot touch pork products. So this simultaneously alienates both of the groups that the British are relying upon. It is extremely brutally crushed by the British East India Company. And as a result of that, more power is given over to the British government. And on November 1st, 1858, Queen Victoria issues a proclamation saying that people of India will receive the same rights that all British people receive. And again, she takes more responsibility into the government, and she ultimately declares herself the Empress of India in 1877. The other person, when we talk about South Africa or Africa in general, the person who really is most significant here is Cecil Rhodes, right? So Cecil Rhodes, as the article suggested, was not really a person who you might anticipate to be some phenomenal leader of the empire, right? He was a rather weak kid, didn't have a great, wasn't very academic. He suffered sort of intermittent health, but he uses his sort of connections and go get a mentality to really bring up himself in the British Empire. And he has a goal to connect South Africa, Cape Town, up to Cairo, and this pledge that he's going to bring all of the eastern portion of Africa under British control. He establishes at first a diamond mining company called the De Beers Company, and then he winds up bringing in a gold mining company. So again, he is just a savvy guy who uses his sort of connections to really become very important. He winds up funding a scholarship to go to Oxford, the Rhodes Scholarship. And at first, it's really a way for people of the British Empire to become better educated and then go out to, um, populate the world. And I'll show something to that effect in a second. I should also point out here that Rhodes is a very controversial figure, right? Some people see him as great. He establishes the Rhodes Scholarship. He donates a lot of money towards the end of his life. He never marries, never has kids, so he has a great amount of money. But then there's the other part of it. He is extremely racist, and he believes in racial segregation, very similar to what happens here in the United States. And he begins the apartheid system that lasts in South Africa up until the 1990s. So you have a guy who is very much synonymous with the sort of British Empire, but he's obviously not a very good person in general. He is a very large British nationalist, right? So one of his famous quotes is, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under the Anglo-Saxon influence. Look again at the extra employment a new country added to our dominion gives." Right, so it's again this idea that Britain is the greatest and they need to go to other places and conquer these people. I think in a lot of ways, the article that was read for today about gentlemen capitalists, right? For a lot of people, how you read that quote that I just read here depends on who you are and what your perspective is, right? If you believe that the British are the best in the world, then it is their obligation to go and conquer the world and show how great they can be. Now that's a fine perspective. It's definitely not right, and it certainly leads to some racist ideologies. But if you look at it in another respect, right, this is an awful ideology, meaning that because you figure yourself to be supreme, you then need to go and conquer these places to either A, make them more like you, or if they decide not to be more like you, to annihilate them. And it creates a tension that is obviously one we still feel till today. So good luck, take care, and be well.